Donald Trump recently made headlines again by suggesting direct cash payments of $1,000 to $2,000 to the American people. In his words, these would be distributions or dividends, but at their core, they operate just like stimulus checks. This marks the third time in 2025 that Trump has either endorsed or openly supported giving money directly back to the public. Whether labeled as a stimulus or a dividend, the fact remains, Trump is repeatedly signaling his willingness to put cash directly in Americans' hands. This is a significant development because politicians rarely float the same idea multiple times unless they intend to seriously pursue it. By repeating the message in different settings across 9 months, Trump is showing both consistency and intent. For millions of Americans who are struggling with inflation, debt, and rising costs of living, even the possibility of another round of checks is enough to spark hope. The important thing now is to evaluate where this money would come from and how realistic this proposal actually is. Trump deliberately used the terms dividend and distribution instead of the traditional phrase stimulus check. This choice of words matters. In the corporate world, a dividend is a payment made to shareholders as a reward for their ownership and investment. By using this language, Trump is essentially framing the American people as shareholders in the nation's economy, suggesting that tariff revenues are profits being shared back with the public. This is clever branding because it positions the checks not as government handouts, but as rightful returns on national trade policy. For the average household, though, the terminology doesn't matter nearly as much as the money itself. Whether it's called a dividend, a rebate, or a stimulus, the bottom line is that families would see an extra $1,000 to $2,000 in their bank accounts. In fact, Trump himself emphasized that the name is irrelevant. What matters is that Americans would directly benefit. This kind of messaging could broaden support even among voters who typically oppose government spending, because it is framed as sharing the nation's success rather than adding a new welfare program. The funding for these proposed checks would come directly from tariff revenues. Tariffs are taxes placed on imported goods, and Trump has long argued that raising them is a way to protect American industries while also boosting federal revenue. According to Trump, tariffs could generate over $1 trillion a year under his approach. While that number may be optimistic, the data shows that revenues are already surging. The U.S. collected $66 billion in tariffs in just 2 months, which equals about $33 billion per month, or over $390 billion annually if the pace continues. To put this into perspective, the U.S. government is currently on track to bring in between $350 and $400 billion in tariff revenues in 2025 alone. That's more than $1 billion every single day. These are not small numbers. When Trump suggests using a portion of this revenue to fund distributions back to the people, he is working with a real and substantial revenue stream. Even if only a part of this money were redirected, it could cover significant payments to households without adding as much to the federal debt as past stimulus packages. Let's break down the math. The United States has roughly 260 million adults and about 130 million households. If the government decided to give $1,000 per adult, the cost would be around $260 billion. If it were $2,000 per adult, that figure would rise to about $520 billion. Even at the higher end, this would still be within the range of projected tariff revenues if Trump's $350 to $400 billion estimates hold true, though it would use up most of the revenue stream. However, it is unlikely that payments would go to every adult without restrictions. More realistically, Trump could target the distributions, for example, limiting them to taxpayers below a certain income threshold or directing them toward working families, Social Security recipients, or veterans. By narrowing eligibility, the overall cost could be cut in half or more, while still delivering meaningful relief. That makes the program not only more affordable, but also more politically strategic, since targeted aid tends to win stronger support among voters. There are several reasons why this proposal should be taken seriously. First, political timing. Checks in the mail are extremely popular, and Trump knows that announcing or delivering direct cash relief ahead of an election would give him a major boost. Past presidents, including Trump himself in 2020, saw noticeable jumps in approval ratings when stimulus checks were sent. Second, economic justification. Tariffs are unpopular because they raise consumer prices. But if people receive direct payments funded by those tariffs, public opinion could shift. This is where the logic becomes powerful. Instead of tariffs being seen as a hidden tax, they would be reframed as a source of household income. The higher the tariffs, the larger the revenues, and the larger the potential payments back to the public. This could turn an unpopular policy into a crowd-pleasing one. For Trump, this is both a smart campaign strategy and a way to validate his economic model. Having mentioned it 3 times in 1 year, it's no longer just talk. It looks more and more like a trial balloon for a central campaign promise. This isn't the first time Trump has supported direct payments. In February 2025, he endorsed the idea of a $5,000 Doge dividend, a proposal tied loosely to digital assets. In July and August, he backed Senator Josh Hawley's American Worker Rebate Act of 2025, which called for $600 rebate checks funded by tariffs. And now, in October, he has directly put forward the idea of $1,000 to $2,000 distributions. This shows a clear progression toward bigger, broader, and more traditional relief measures. The pattern is important. Politicians often test ideas gradually, starting with niche proposals, moving to smaller-scale endorsements, and then finally making bold national promises. Trump's shift from a niche Doge dividend to supporting a senator's rebate bill, and now to proposing $2,000 per person, shows that he is warming the public up for something major. Each step builds legitimacy and signals that he may well include this policy in his broader 2026 platform. For ordinary Americans, an extra $1,000 to $2,000 could make a huge difference. For working families, it could cover a month's rent, a car payment, or medical expenses. For retirees on Social Security, it could help offset the rising costs of food, utilities, and prescriptions. In an economy where many households report having less than $500 in emergency savings, even a single payment of this size would provide immediate relief and financial stability. Beyond individual households, the broader economy would also feel the impact. Past stimulus payments triggered spikes in consumer spending that boosted small businesses and lifted GDP growth. A new round of checks, even framed as dividends from tariffs, would likely have the same effect. In short, these payments wouldn't just help individuals, they could give the entire economy a shot of momentum. That makes them appealing both economically and politically. Of course, not everyone agrees with the idea. Economists often warn that tariffs are essentially a hidden tax on consumers, since importers typically pass the extra costs onto American buyers. That means households are already paying more at the store. Sending out distributions after raising tariffs could feel like taking with one hand and giving with the other. In addition, large payments could add pressure to inflation if consumer demand spikes too quickly. Another criticism is the impact on federal debt. America's national debt now sits at nearly $38 trillion, up sharply from $36 trillion just a couple of years ago. Even if tariffs fund the checks, any gap in revenue could add to borrowing. Finally, critics point out that cash distributions close to an election could look like vote buying. While popular among voters, the political optics may spark backlash from opponents in Congress. These concerns don't make the proposal impossible, but they do highlight the challenges ahead. Despite the risks, there are strong reasons to believe this proposal has a real chance. Trump has mentioned it 3 separate times, which shows persistence. The funding mechanism, tariff revenue, is already in place and growing, with monthly collections over $30 billion. The political incentives are obvious. Few policies are as popular as checks in people's mailboxes. And by linking it directly to tariffs, Trump can claim the payments are not new spending, but a redistribution of trade revenues. This could transform the public's perception of tariffs. Instead of being viewed solely as a burden, they could become a source of household income. If more Americans start associating tariffs with direct payments, support for higher tariffs could grow. That flips the narrative in Trump's favor and sets him up to defend both his trade and economic policies. For these reasons, it's very possible that the idea of $1,000 to $2,000 checks could move from a campaign talking point to an actual policy. At the end of the day, whether these payments are called stimulus checks, rebates, dividends, or distributions, the effect would be the same: money directly in Americans' pockets. Based on Trump's repeated endorsements, the scale of tariff revenues, and the upcoming election cycle, this proposal feels less like a passing comment and more like a serious possibility. With tariffs already generating record sums, the funding case is credible. The big questions that remain are: who will qualify? How much will the payments be? And when might they arrive? My opinion is that Trump is carefully shaping this as a centerpiece policy for 2026, using tariff revenues as the justification. If delivered, it could shift public opinion on tariffs and provide real relief to struggling households. Whether you see it as economics or politics, the bottom line is clear: Trump is laying the groundwork for a new kind of stimulus built on America's trade policies.